Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about how I made this plush, just the process of how I selected it from all the commission requests I got, how I designed the overall look of this plush based off of what my client asked, and then how I chose the colors of this plush, and then the prototyping process of how I put the pattern together and then sewing it all together in the end. If you've ever read one of my plush write-ups on my website before, this is basically the vlog version of those write-ups. So this is Matcha, and to be honest with you, I don't even know what type of creature he's supposed to be. I think he's a mix of a dragon with a bug, maybe a caterpillar because of the extra legs, but he's super cute either way. So when I got the request in my spring 2022 round, I really love the character. I think the client had asked me for the plush once before and it didn't make it into that round, but I did select it for my spring 2022 round. Again, just this shows you if you're interested in commissioning me and you don't get selected one time to please apply again, because it just totally depends on what requests I get at that time and what I'm feeling at the moment. It doesn't mean that I'll never select your project. It's just all dependent on things going on at that time. So I chose Matcha for this round. Thought he'd translate really well to plush form. He's just a super cute character, and the client specifically requested him in a chibi version with my standing Neko Atsume pattern. Obviously that pattern needed to be adjusted because it had 4 legs, but Matcha has 6 here. And it'd been quite a while since I'd used that pattern, but I wanted to use it more, but also wanted to adjust it in general too, because it's been, like I said, many years since I used it last and it needed to be updated. Another thing I really liked about the application was that my client provided a sketch of what they wanted the plush to look like. It was a very simple drawing of Matcha and in the style of my Neko Atsume pattern. Sketches like that just help me visualize what the client is looking for, even not something very simple like the sketch I received. So I always rely on my Shannon swatch set, which if you don't have one of these and you like making plushies, I highly recommend. This is only half of what you get when you buy one. There's a book version as well, but I really like this version with the long swatches, because if I don't have a color and I want to send it to a client, I can just snip off a little bit from the bottom here, and then I still get to have it myself. I added little names here at the bottom because otherwise all the names here are at the top and you have to kind of count to see which one it is along the way. So having these little swatches with the names at the bottom is a lot more helpful. So looking at the character and the greens available, well, there weren't many good matches for the character for the 2 main colors, and a big reason for that was because the best color, which was green apple, is actually a discontinued color from Shannon, which is a shame because it's a very nice greenish yellow color, and they keep seemingly discontinuing some of the most unique colors for plush making. I guess people don't like making baby blankets with these types of colors, which always seems to be what they cater to. But I really like green apple, which isn't on the swatch set because it's a discontinued color, but I still had some stashed away in my massive stash of fabric, and that was going to be for the main color of the body here. And then I also used evergreen, I believe, for the points here, and then I used seafoam for the wings, and then I used mint for the lighter color green, and I used banana for the yellow colors here. The darker green is actually from Hope and Textiles. Again, looking at the Shannon colors and then comparing the entire color palette, I didn't really like any of the greens that matched the top of Matcha. So I went through Hope and Textiles swatch book and selected this color here, which I thought went well with the entire color palette and matched the character pretty well. Since my client is international, I just took some photos, got everything squared away, made my order with Hopin, and then Matcha was in the middle of my commission round, so it took a while until I actually started him. So when it was time to make Matcha, I took a look at my Neko Atsume pattern and some plushies that I made with it, and it again, it's been several years since I used it, and since I've come along in my skills since then, it was a good idea to update it. It was mainly in the leg area that obviously I needed to add another pair of legs, but I also wanted to make the pattern a bit more complex because it was just a bit too simple for my taste now. And just in general, the way that plush stood in the photos that I had taken of it just needed to be corrected a little bit. I didn't really care for the way that the plush looked in the back anymore. And for the neck area, I had already patterned a variation of this for Drago, trade I did with a friend of mine, and so I had that squared away, but I'd have to adjust the face because Matcha has a very round face here, and then to add the bug tail as well. For the legs, besides adding the pair, I also wanted to add some darts along the butt here. So it might be a little hard to see, but he's got a couple darts along the butt and leg area here. And what that does is just defines this shape a little bit more so it's not as flat. So you can see that his butt kind of juts out a little bit here and it has a nice rounder shape. So I started by taking the pattern and then adding the middle set of legs in here, and then also Frankensteining my pattern for Drago, the neck, the elongated neck piece onto that Neko Atsume pattern, and then adding the darts onto the butt. And then I would add the tail on separately using my method of attaching appendages by machine sewing, which I'll put a link to if you're interested in learning how to do that. And so when I sewed that together, the legs looked a little too skinny. I really wanted this plush to be chibi and chunky, and the legs just were a little too skinny for my liking there. So one of my techniques when I'm patterning something is that if something is symmetrical, like the legs on Matcha here, I will only do one side of the plush with what I'm trying to test out so that I don't have to double my work for nothing. Since I only did the prototype for one side of the legs, all I did was tuck in the legs on the other side of the pattern that I hadn't finished yet into the body of the plush, and then I used my method of machine sewing appendages, that whole patterning method where essentially I pattern each leg separately and then pinned it onto the plush so that I didn't have to remake the entire body from scratch. And since I had to redo the legs, I wanted to make sure that everything was in proportion with what I was about to make, so I held off and then moved on to a couple other edits I needed to make. One was the stomach area came out a little too skinny. I wanted him to be chunky, and so since it came out too skinny, rather than having to redo everything by seam ripping this gusset out and sewing it all back together, I just cut down the very middle of the gusset and then put in a vent piece, which was about 1.5 inches wide or so, how I wanted it to be fatter. So then I could just sew in that vent piece into the gusset rather than having to redo the whole prototype from scratch again. So the last part was doing the head. I struggled a lot with this. It's crazy because it's such a simple round shape, but sometimes the simplest shapes are the hardest ones to make. It did need to stick out from the neck quite a bit, but I way overestimated this when I was patterning it, and I stuck the neck out just way too far. You can see how ridiculous this looks. It looks like E.T. pretty much. I was also doing a similar technique to adding vents or extension pieces to the neck area to stick the head out rather than having to redo everything from scratch again. But I had just extended it too far. So first, when I was patterning this head, it just started as a circle with 4 darts in it on the top, the bottom, and the 2 sides. And this is a common way to get that shape, is just by adding these darts at the 4 sides of the circle. But the way I did this, the face was coming out too flat. So I didn't have this rounded shape here that I ended up making. I had a very flat face, but I wanted it to be a nice sphere. So what I did was backtrack a little bit, and I made it an actual seam down the front of the face. And I just did that by just basically ignoring the darts and taking the seam all the way down the front of the face. And so you can see in this prototype here, I have that seam running down the face, but I try to avoid seams going down the face, especially in the areas with embroidery, just because it can be kind of distracting and detracts from the overall design of the plush. So my plan was to prototype it with that seam down the front just so I could get that round shape, but then I can remove the seam where it ends up being a little bit more of a straight line at this area in the pattern, and then just run the dart down to that point. Removing seams from the front of the face also makes embroidery a whole lot easier, because if I had a seam running down his entire face here, I would have to line up his mouth, which is a bit of a pain. And then if I don't sew it perfectly, the eyes can be uneven, and then the whole face could just be asymmetrical, which doesn't look very good. The next thing I wanted to pattern was this bug tail, and it's one of my favorite parts of Matcha. I just think that the shape and design of it is super cute. So this piece here, this tail piece, is a 4-piece pattern, and it's one of the more complex ones that I've made. So I have a 2 side pieces, which are the same pattern piece here, and then I have a gusset running down the top here, and then another gusset running down the bottom, and this just makes this tail nice and fat and shapely. So this tail ends in a couple points here, which is kind of tricky to pattern because I didn't want to sew them on separately and be just a different piece like these ones here. I wanted it to actually be a part of the tail so that it looks cohesive. And I did that just by ending this pattern piece in a triangle up here, and then these gusset pieces, both the top and the bottom, also form triangles at the bottom piece. And then when you sew it all together, it makes this triangular shape here. And you just have to make sure to get in there with your scissors and clip all the way down into that seam to really define that point. On the prototype, I didn't add this 3D aspect up here on this tail because I knew how I was going to do it, so I didn't need to prototype it or anything. All I did was, when I drew on the pattern for the color transitions, I just made sure to mark where I wanted this 3D piece to be. And I'll talk about how I did this 3D part later on in the process. So now that I had the tail patterned, even though the tail came out a little bit too big, but I really like the overall shape of it, I could go ahead and add the legs on. So I did sew these separately and then pin them on to the one side of the plush. I did like the overall chubby, short shape of them, and originally I was planning on sewing them separately onto the body piece and having a seam here above every leg and then adding a dart here to kind of shape them out some more. But I did end up deciding to get rid of that idea. I just thought that the extra seams on the legs here would really detract from the simple design of this plush, and since it's meant to be a chibi, very simplified version of this character, having too many extra seams here would kind of detract from the overall look of the plush. So the last thing I did was just make a couple quick pairs of test horns and wings. Very simple shape, so not a whole lot to think about here. I pretty much just referenced the image of the character exactly for the shape of the wings, and then for the horns just making sure that where they attach to the head on the inside here is shallower than on the outside here, so it kind of has to be at an angle where it hits that head. And then from there I needed to draw on the color transition. So this was one that took a bit of thought, because I'll put up the image of Matcha again. You can see that he's more of a gradient, that his color transitions are soft and they blend into each other. So I wasn't going to do any gradients on this plush. It was all going to be just hard color transitions. So the one thing about the head was that he had a darker color on his face than the rest of his body. So it was supposed to be the color of the back of his wings or his horns here. So while I drew it on as an option for my client, I ended up recommending to omit that just because, again, his face was going to get pretty busy for such a simple plush. So not only do you have the color transition here, you would have another one on top of that, and then the question was, well, how do you even finish that color transition? Is it a point? Is it a circle? And then you also have his blush here, and then the extra pieces for his cheeks, and then the horns. It would just be a lot going on in such a simple plush to have another color transition on top of that. And then to darken the face too would have not been as appealing, I think, as a lighter color. So then I kind of mocked up this other version of Matcha that had only this green part running all the way down his back instead, which is the version that I made for this plush. The other finicky bit, but I didn't want to remove it because I thought it was such a cute detail, was the little dark green parts that were his toes. And then he also has paw pads, which have the circle here, but then also have some very small white polka dots. So while these polka dots in the reference image were random and there were a lot more of him, his feet here are just round circles. So I couldn't put as many of them on the plush as they are in the reference image, and then I just simplified it to be just a circle around the paw pad itself. The last back and forth I had with my client was on the wings. When I had made the prototype, they were sticking out more like this. My plan was to actually run a dart down the side here that I could machine sew the wings into rather than hand sewing them on, which is what I ended up doing. My client wanted them to be more flush to the body and at this angle rather than sticking out, which I agreed with overall. I think it makes for a better silhouette than just these random wings sticking out, and kind of looks more bat-like, if you will. So easy fix. They were just pinned on in the prototype, and then it just results in hand sewing, which is easier to pattern overall because I hadn't patterned that dart into my prototype yet. So with my prototype done, the next part was to take it apart for the pattern to transfer any adjustments I had made while sewing it onto the paper pattern, and since I also draw on the color transitions, I have to scan that into my computer so I can use it in my embroidery program and just draw the embroidery directly onto those images. The legs were tricky because they were pinned on to my pattern, and it was such a small area. Instead of just drawing on where they join like I normally do with that technique, I decided to just keep them pinned on and tape them on to make sure that they didn't move to transfer those legs to my pattern, and it just didn't work out. I just didn't do a good job, basically. I wasn't careful enough about transferring the pattern, so when I went to sew it together on the plush, the gusset here where the legs sew onto the gusset versus how the legs fall on the outside pattern just wasn't lining up, so I couldn't get that to work, and I couldn't fix it on a final plush because it would just be extra seams or something that I'd have to add, where I'd have to add more fabric to get it to all line up. So unfortunately I had to start over on the sides of the plush, which is extra unfortunate because, like I mentioned earlier, this is Green Apple Minky, which is a discontinued color. I already feel bad when I have to use a discontinued color because I'm like, oh, I'm never gonna get to use this again, and I have to really make it worth it. To waste it on top of that just feels extra bad. But I was able to use what I salvaged from the body later on for this plush, so I didn't feel too bad at the end of the day. But I did the embroidery for the face too. It came out pretty clean. I only did one test for the eyes. The tail has every color in his color palette besides the seafoam color in his wings. So having to do this applique with all these different colors was a bit tricky, just making sure that I got the order right on how I laid down every single color, and then having to change threads back and forth took a long time. But I really like how the sides look. I think it looks really clean and really nice. So then the 3D aspects of Matcha that I really like, starting with these cheeks right here. I originally had them both as mint, the front and the back, but then I was like, oh, I should actually make the back of them green apple to help with this color transition here. It just helps that blend from this green apple color to the mint color. Pretty subtle and not something that people will notice looking at this plush, but it was a detail that made me happy when I did it. And then the 3D aspects on the tail I really like as well. It's probably one of my favorite things I've done in a while. So doing this was actually pretty easy. All I did was pattern the gusset, but then I essentially just duplicated that gusset piece starting at the top and then went down to where I wanted it to end in points. And I sewed it together as just a 2-part pattern piece, a top and a bottom, and top stitched it on in the seam allowance along this gusset. So then when I laid it flat, I just had a gusset piece that had this 3D effect from layering 2 extra gusset pieces on top of the total gusset. And I did that same technique for the back here too, with these 2 extra pieces. For the tail pieces, I actually had my embroidery machine just sew them out for me. Using some tearaway stabilizer, I just put the 2 pieces of minky on it and then let the machine stitch out the bottom pieces so that I could get these triangles even and clean. So it just makes for a fun little detail when you look at it from the side or when you look at it from the top. Just gives a little bit more interest to a simple plush, as opposed to if I were to just do something like adding a column stitch or a satin stitch. Was probably how I was going to do this if I hadn't done this 3D effect. So the bumps at the front here were kind of a similar concept, where these are just extra pattern pieces sewn together, and then I actually sew them into the seam of this color transition here between the banana and the mint color here. So I also let my embroidery machine stitch these out because they're circles, and circles are very difficult to get even and clean. So they stitch it out for me, and I just use tearaway stabilizer so that I don't have any extra stabilizer left over. If I use cutaway, then it would still remain on the seam and on such a delicate and small piece. It's just a better idea to use the tearaway stabilizer. I stuffed him with Fairfield Silky Polyfill. So it's a type of mochi stuffing just to get him a little bit more soft. I use different types of polyfill for my different projects on my standing anthro patterns that are a little bit more display-like and they need more structure to them to help them stand. I use just normal polyfill. For my dittos that are very stretchy and soft, I use Hope & Textiles mochi stuffing, which is my absolute favorite. Then for Matcha here, I used Fairfield Silky Polyfill, which is really nice and still very squishy and soft, but it's a little bit more firm than the Hope & Textiles, which is good for a standing plush like this because it'll just give him a little bit more weight to help him stand up evenly. Where the Hope & Textiles is just super soft and just more like a squishmallow type filling. So the dark green horns are machine sewn onto the plush. The tiny little lighter green horns are hand sewn on, and then the wings again are hand sewn on as well, just so I can get that sleek to the body silhouette here. If I were to use darts, then they'd likely stick out more like this. It has just 1 layer of felt in there to make them stand up on their own so that they're not flopping down if it was just minky. So you can check out my other video on adding stability to pieces without using wire. That's the technique I used here. I only used 1 layer of felt here because it was such a small piece it didn't need any more. And then they're nice and floppy and still have a lot of movement to them. So that's about it. I really like how this plush came out. I think it's one of the cutest plushies that I've made. I just love the design of this character and think he translates so well to plush form, and it's just friendly little face really liked having him around the house, so it'll be kind of difficult to let him go. But if you're interested in more, I do have a write-up version of this video on my website, and then I also have a process video of the making of this plush, so basically a time lapse of me sewing him together. So I know I put up some clips of some of the parts that I discussed here, but you can see all of it at once. So thanks for watching. Bye.